Welcome to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican fraternity and co-hosts of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Matthew Mayer.
And today Matthew wanted to talk about the School of Salamanca. This is all going to be education for me, and so Matthew, take it away.
Well, the reason I wanted to mention the School of Salamanca was I've been noticing recently on media a strange unhinged turn on many Christians taking on more anti-humanistic stance, even among Catholics, where to restore social order you gotta use authoritarian measures and to crush down your opponents so that you can actually get things in line. And the Dominicans who were living in Spain actually had to deal with that issue from the Spanish government having an autocratic stance at the time in the 16th century. And then there were many Dominicans who were actually responding to the Spanish government on actually wanting to provide more humanistic measures. And the School of Salamanca would be one of the biggest influences of Christian humanism. And so it began in the city of Salamanca at the university over there, School of Salamanca.
In Spain. Mm-hmm.
It began by the Dominican Thomas Francisco de Vitoria and, can't say it right, Francisco de Vitoria and Domingo de Soto. It was also continued by the Carmelites, Complutenus and Salamance. But one of the influences was actually St. Alphonsus Liguori, and the Jesuits were the ones who completed the school by the end of its run. And it was and the influences for the Jesuits have been Pedro de Fonseca, Luis de Molina, Gabriel Vasquez, and Francisco Suarez in the 17th century. And apologize, I'm very bad at pronouncing these names. Okay, so we have Domingo de Soto. He taught that civil law must have a moral foundation, and he used natural law to criticize Spanish laws regulating charities and consequently violating the rights of the poor by depriving them of their needs. So if you have a regulation over a church of Christians using charity as how they believe it should be done, they believe that you're suppressing the poor by regulating what the poor actually needs, and so therefore depriving them of their natural rights to, say, life, because a lot of the poor need these charities to continue living. And Dominicans created the concept of human rights, since the Europeans thought indigenous Americans, which the Spanish were colonizing, had no rights from their paganism and primitivism. And so the idea was that because they were pagans, they have no right, and the Christians have a right because they worship the true God. And so the church the Dominicans actually argued that they had rights by nature, which is given by God. There's a difference between divine right and natural right, both given by God, and therefore cannot be in conflict with each other. And because of that distinction between spiritual and civil authority, they actually distinguish church and state by restricting temporal power to the king or emperor and spiritual power to the pope. Now, I did mention, like many episodes ago, about integralism, but we also had to take a realization that even integralism can be authoritarian, and the Dominicans actually wanted to put limits on the government, saying, okay, so even if you had a church-state relation, there still has to be a distinction between the two so that you don't end up creating a theocracy or give the emperor way more power than he should have. And so they said, yeah, in the church-state relations, but at the same time doesn't mean no limits. And because of that, the Dominicans actually challenged the divine right of kings theory by stating that authority came from God through the people. It was actually a rebuttal against the newly formed Church of England, which used the divine right of kings to give King Henry VIII divine sanction over England. Therefore, it would actually legitimize his authoritarianism. And because they were the Dominicans criticized the divine right of kings and said that the right to authority was given by God through the people. It actually legitimized pagan kings because they weren't directly divinely sanctioned by God, but they were arguing that's not how authority works. And so Francisco Suarez used this to legitimize the right to revolution against unjust governments, so the indigenous Americans could rebel against Spanish colonizers if they were actually harming the common good, which would be the anti-humanistic measures over the indigenous. Gabriel Vasquez popularized limited government by requiring societies to respect natural rights. So you're saying, you have a duty to protect these natural rights among the indigenous. So, and if you don't not, you're actually making yourself unjust and therefore legitimize revolution against you. So you're going to have to behave yourself. So that was where limited government comes from. The School of Salamanca being a popularizer of that. And Suarez formed government by consent after suggesting that a community comes from consensus and making democracies and republics natural governments. Monarchies exist as legitimate governments, though only by consent. One of the biggest proponents of that was actually St. Robert Bellarmine, and fun fact, Thomas Jefferson actually had a book from him with him, and I think it's in Monticello still. I don't remember, but it was reported that he actually had a book from St. Robert Bellarmine. And it pretty much was one of the influences on the American Republic. So this country had influence from the School of Salamanca, from its foundations. And so Francisco de Vitoria formed international law by supporting the common good of the world through universal rights like liberty. And the school used human rights to apply ethics in just war doctrine. So it said, so basically, this was a rebuttal to the Spaniards saying you can't just war against the indigenous because they're pagans. So you have to actually fulfill the criteria of making the war just. If you don't fulfill that criteria, you can't go against rebelling against the pagans. The pagans have the right to defend themselves if you are engaging in an unjust war. And then he was speaking to the Spaniards on that. Now, scholars like Bartolomé de las Casas, a famous Dominican in the School of Salamanca, he used just war ethics to condemn Spanish colonialism and slavery. So this is a rebuttal against the conquistadors who were enslaving the indigenous, I would say, across the Americas. Francisco Vitoria used the natural right to liberty to prohibit restrictions on free movement and trade. And so travel, immigration, and commerce were natural rights. However, according to Catholic doctrine, the common good superseding individual rights require regulations over travel, immigration, and commerce. So basically the point would be, yes, free trade is a natural right, but that doesn't mean it's an absolute one. Just like when we argue about in distributism, you have a right to a free market, but it can't be laissez-faire. It has to be regulated. And so the School of Salamanca was not saying we're going to have a absolute these free movement was going to be absolute, saying restrictions apply only according to the common good, but so far they should be generally applied the freedom of movement because these were natural rights. Just war doctrine and colonization can be permissible if the criteria are met, like restricting natural rights from foreigners. So the School of Salamanca didn't support strict individualism. They still believed there was still responsibility for each individual to fulfill. And the indigenous did engage in an unjust war against the Spaniards, and the Spaniards had also the right to go to war with them and to even colonize their land for the sake of defense. But that's only if that the indigenous were going to war with the Spaniards, which I would say wouldn't be much a surprise when it comes to pagan culture, although that would depend whichever tribe you go to. It's paganism isn't like one big universal idea. It actually comes in different forms in different locations. And regardless, the Spanish Jesuit priest Pedro de Oñate used the natural right to liberty to support contractual freedom against government intervention. I know I was mentioning the Jesuits here, but they were getting influence from the Dominicans right here. And so because of contractual freedom against government intervention, that would pretty much be basically a predecessor to constitutionalism. Or actually, no, the constitutionalism was actually something that was thought up during the medieval age, but it was still popularized throughout the School of Salamanca. And Catholic prelate Diego de Covarrubias y Leiva stated that privately owning property and its benefits is a natural right. So there's another thing the School of Salamanca was saying is you have the natural right to own private property based on your human dignity. As part of the things that comes from Christian humanism is recognizing the dignity of the individual. Saying, not necessarily saying that there is no common good, but saying that the common good can't be possible if there's no dignity in each person. And Luis de Molina argued that people can take better care of their own goods than the government, which is basically a case of the free market. Not absolute, but generally a free market, saying the government needs to loosen its restrictions on how to do your marketing. I would say marketing, how would you buy and what would you sell? Of course, because this is the School of Salamanca from Dominicans, they wouldn't go absolute saying there are some things you really shouldn't buy. But saying that the government shouldn't really also intervene so much, saying that the market should be able to handle, not necessarily on its own, but through the community. It's a lot to do with psychology and solidarity and how you know your community better than other ones. But regardless, the theologian Martin de Azpilicueta theorized the quantity theory of money by stating that the prices of goods and services corresponds to the circulating money supply. Too much money in circulation will lead to inflation. So the School of Salamanca actually warned about inflation happening if the government basically owns too much money, and so it has to keep circulating. But it has to keep circulating, but not take that much. And the school supported price theory against labor theory by suggesting that public interest made price value rather than labor hours. So basically, the Austrian School of Economics would call this a predecessor to the subjective theory of value by stating that value of goods doesn't come from how much labor hours you put into, but rather what is the public's perception. Like, you can make something really good. It took hard work to do, but the public could be like, nah, we don't care about it. We like the thing that was made by less effort because that's actually what we value more. The Dominicans actually recognized that and said that this is actually a more realistic way to judge something's value, at least economically. Not if there's actually something like objectively important about it, about what's up. But other than that, the schools permitted interest on loans only if the benefit will outweigh the cost. They weren't necessarily saying usury is a good thing, but they were saying that usury can at least be permissible only in extreme circumstances where the benefit will outweigh the cost. Not usury, I mean just charging on interest. It's an interchangeable term. It can be a nitpick right there. But other than that, from what I remember researching, it said casuistry developed over the years and developed very abstract ideas to moral problems. The Spanish theologian Bartolomé de Medina developed probabilism and taught that if one does not know what to believe or do, he must follow at least what is most probable. If you're basically confused saying, should I do this or should I do this? What's the right thing to do? That basically the idea would be just follow your conscience. Just do what you think is the right thing if you don't know which is the right thing.
If it's well-formed conscience, right?
I would say well-formed conscience, yes. Hopefully you have a well-formed mind at least. If you don't know what to do, basically contemplate, consider it, think about it, and make the right decision. If you think that the risk isn't worth taking, then don't take the risk. And Dominicans, and this is the biggest one. The biggest problem going on in the school was Dominicans and Jesuits disputed each other with the De Auxiliis controversy on reconciling free will with divine omniscience. The Dominicans emphasized grace being necessary, while the Jesuits said grace and free will can be separate. The Jesuits did not believe in total depravity and accused the Dominicans of supporting heresy. The Dominicans would say the Jesuits, you support Pelagianism, but the Jesuits would accuse the Dominicans saying, you support Lutheranism. Because the Dominicans saying we have sinned, but we need grace to do good, and later the Jesuits saying you can be good even without grace, but that's almost saying it in the sense of Pelagianism. Until Pope Paul V later settled the debate by stating that the Dominicans were right about grace and the Jesuits right about opposing total depravity. So from Pope Paul V saying people are not totally depraved, but they still have sin that still corrupts them, and so do need grace at least.
And that's what I was going to say. I mean, I don't think they were. I think the Jesuits sound like they were misplacing or overreaching their accusation of total depravity being applied in the Dominicans, because I don't hear that concept being applied as so much, because as a former Lutheran, I'm familiar with the total depravity, and also don't think that. So in my understanding, Luther said that we were just heaps of dung, and Jesus covered us like snow. He wasn't even getting us out of being heaps of dung. Whereas in our Catholic faith, and I think what you're saying with the Dominicans is, yes, we have sin, but we need grace, and that is what the Catholic standing is. I guess that whole spiel on my part was, I don't think that they Jesuits rightly accused the Dominicans, because I don't think they even came close to total depravity.
Well, things did get ugly with the Jesuits and Dominicans. It was getting really heated between them. No, and also one more thing is Francisco de Vitoria said that evil exists in the world as an abuse of free will. Something that was talked about. The problem of evil was actually talked about in the School of Salamanca, and it was like, why is there evil in the world? He said evil exists because we have free will. But this is something that he would, and a lot of people say because we have free will, but something that a lot of people don't say afterwards is, if there was no free will, then it would also not be possible for us to be good. So he said evil is a consequence of free will, but free will is necessary if we are to love. They said that's the only way you can have a love that is authentic, is by a free will. And so the school developed all these humanistic ideas, or humanistic theories, in light of Catholic revelation as well, and classical philosophy, that these rights are natural rights and must be respected. And for a lot of Catholics who are growing in authoritarianism and growing in, let's say, unhinged politics at the current era right now, to place order and to suppress enemies, they must understand part of their Catholic history is to develop Christian humanism. It is, in the School of Salamanca, the second wave of scholasticism. It is part of our Catholic heritage to continue this Christian humanism, and to show that we're not necessarily just faith. We're also we are faith, but we also have reason, and by our reason, that we could actually correlate faith. We can use faith to sanction how to treat others well.
You're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio, Radio for Acadiana. We are your Third Order Dominicans, your lay Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana. And this is Studium to Studio, where we share the fruits of our contemplation with you every Thursday at 4 p.m., thanks to Stein Lumber, with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And so today we're talking about the School of Salamanca. Now, this is not necessarily a school, but a movement that took place at the University of Salamanca in Spain. And so Matthew, what was the driving force that started this school? What was they were responding to something? Obviously, the Spanish government. Was there a larger movement and controversy going on at the time?
Well, I wouldn't know about there being a larger controversy, but I do know this was occurring right after the Counter-Reformation, or touching along with it. It was around the time there was the Counter-Reformation happening. It was a response to the rising heresy that was happening. It was right. I would say definitely this was during the Age of Exploration, so this is right after the Renaissance. So they were getting humanistic influences. So with driving force, I would say this was something that was actually being built up from a century ago, or well, I would say a century ago, according to some people getting a little nitpicky by saying, where did the Renaissance start? Some people start in the 1400s in Venice or Florence, or they're gonna say, some people can get a little nitpicky with that, but it was still something that was actually building up to Christian humanism, of influences, and even like St. Thomas More was even a Christian humanist, and made his book. I can't remember his book, and I read it actually. Oh, Utopia. He made his book Utopia. It was, some people say, a predecessor to communism, but he actually said this is not possible because of sin. And so he would say, at least he was a realist when it comes to say this is never going to happen. But even as a Christian humanist, he still died a martyr because he refused to follow King Henry VIII when it comes to being a member of the Church of England. And so when it comes to the Spanish government, the Spanish government was how would I say, it was basically they were trying to expand territory across the Americas. They had that idea of trying to colonize the indigenous because they needed to respond to the rising I guess I would say that it was actually more of a response to the heresies going on at the time, and it was actually seen as a threat to the government because of their close ties to the church, so that they would have to colonize the Americas and they go and suppress the indigenous of their rights because they were actually more, I guess you would say, fearing of the heresies going on across Europe. And so because of Protestantism on the rise in Europe, they would actually saw this as a threat to their authority. And because of the close ties between church and state, Spain actually had like a really close tie, at least second to France until the French Revolution, at least.
Yeah, I think it was during this time. If you ever see the movie The Mission, I think Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, I think, starred in it, taking place at this time, and you see the Spanish government coming in and trying to dominate the indigenous people at the time. Very good music, good music, good movie. I divert. So back to private property. There's been a lot of discussion about the value of private property. You see the rise of some sectors, even in our own country, kind of dismissing the value of private property. But yet, even Pope Leo XIII, in one of his encyclicals, specifically talks about the value of private property. And this was something that was really inherent in the School of Salamanca. And why do you think that this was, such an important aspect of the School of Salamanca?
I would say it's because of what was going on with the indigenous at that time. And also, just a note, just before I continue going, I would mention a note. The funny thing, you are for native rights, you are for indigenous rights, you want to support, let's say indigenous having their freedom against coercion to practice their culture, then listen very carefully. The Dominicans wanted to support private property because it was actually to defend the indigenous against the Spanish from colonizing them. They were trying to protect their property, and so they were saying so private property was necessary to stop colonialism. So therefore, private property and colonialism cannot go together if ownership of property is a natural right. Just to let anyone who wants to pay very close attention to this.
Thanks for letting that be a highlighted point. That's good.
There's also discussion that's always been interesting, talking about interest on a loan. And I know that there are some camps out there that and in Catholic Church stated in the Third Lateran Council that viewing that sort of activity as very much a negative. But then I think we've seen the economics change over periods of time, and I don't think we hear it a lot discussed today per se, because I think especially in our economy, interest on investments, on loans takes place pretty adamantly across our economy. What did they say about about interest. Was there any value in it? Did they, equate it the same thing as usury, which, seems to be, two similar things but separate? What do you think?
It was actually very complicated, but the church's stance has been that usury is a sin because it actually makes people use money to buy money, and the idea was it didn't seem like it followed the just price theory, and also it seemed like a form of, I guess you would say, stealing, because you're taking more money than was worth if you're trying to give them on a loan. But the School of Salamanca was not saying that usury was good. It was saying that getting an interest is permissible if benefits will outweigh the cost. Now, I caught that second line from Thomas Sowell, but the thing is that that's what we were trying to say, is that if you're going to lose money to get this loan, and the loan will actually help you in the long run, then we will permit it. But we can't normalize getting basically stealing from financial stealing. They said this is only permissible if there's like a win-win situation here, no zero sum or positive sum, I guess you would say. And so the idea would be not sanctioning, but at least a permission.
So just basically to summarize everything, we're talking about the School of Salamanca, which is, like you said, Jeff, a movement that began at the University of Salamanca. Am I correct? And that and Matthew, you're talking about a lot of the Dominicans and I love the details on how they were developing ideas that might have been going around in the Renaissance, but they were fine-tuning them and applying them to the indigenous, to humanism, to helping the indigenous to have their rights. And am I kind of summarizing that appropriately?
Yes, I would say it was to help the indigenous to support their rights, and it was also as an opposition towards the Spanish government. And if I remember reading this right, I remember reading in Thomas Wood Jr.'s book, Catholic. It was on Catholic history. I forgot what the title was, but it's the only book he wrote on Catholic history. It was basically talking about how the Spanish government was actually trying to go after the Dominicans for trying to suppress their authority, and the Dominicans were arguing back at the Spanish government, saying that you have to respect these natural rights. And this was actually, and a lot of people have considered the School of Salamanca as the birth of human rights.
Was that book Triumph?
No, that was another author.
Okay, I was trying to help you remember, but Jeff, do you have any final words about the School of Salamanca? No,
it's just that the university itself, really has a strong place in our Catholic history. We look at who attended and who was there. Of course, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and also Saint Teresa of Avila spent the night there just after her reform was approved by Rome. So we have very strong Catholic presence at the university. Of course, strong presence of Dominicans not only at the University of Salamanca but the School of Salamanca as well.
So remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...